Every person sleeping in a vehicle tonight will exhale approximately 1 liter of water vapor before morning. That number is not a rough estimate. It reflects what the human body releases during 8 hours of sleep through respiration alone. In a sealed car, that liter of water has nowhere to go. It rises as invisible vapor circulates in the trapped air, finds the coldest surface it can, which is almost always the glass, and drops out of the air as liquid. By morning, the windows are streaming. The bedding has absorbed some of what the glass didn't catch. The carpet under the seat is damp in a way that doesn't look serious, but doesn't dry either. And this happens every single night, compounding, accumulating, quietly building towards something worse than discomfort. The mistake that nearly everyone makes when they first sleep in a vehicle is assuming condensation is an inconvenience. It is not. It is a physical process that, left unmanaged, becomes a health problem, a structural problem, and eventually a permanent smell that no amount of airing out will fully reverse. The American Lung Association has documented that even without visible mold, dampness in an enclosed space causes asthma attacks and upper and lower respiratory problems. The enclosed volume of a car concentrates airborne irritants far more than any room in a building would. A person sleeping in a damp car night after night is not sleeping in discomfort. They are slowly wrecking their lungs while they sleep. The standard advice is nearly useless. Crack a window. Everyone says it. And cracking a window does help, but only if you understand what it's actually doing, and only if you position that crack correctly, and only if you've already addressed the moisture sources that no window gap can compensate for. Because here is what the common advice misses entirely. Ventilation is the output mechanism, not the solution. The problem starts before air ever hits the glass. It starts with everything wet, damp, or moisture-laden that entered the vehicle before the person closed their eyes. A man who had spent 2 winters sleeping in a Dodge Caravan in Denver described the progression in terms that most written guides never capture. First week, it was just the windows being foggy in the morning. I thought that was normal. Second week, I noticed the seat was damp under the sleeping bag. Third week, I started waking up with a cough that didn't go away. It was February. I thought I was getting sick from the cold. It wasn't the cold. What he was describing is the standard arc of unmanaged condensation in a vehicle. A timeline that moves from cosmetic nuisance to respiratory involvement faster than anyone expects. The physics driving all of this is not complicated, but it is counterintuitive. Cold air cannot hold as much moisture as warm air. When a person climbs into a vehicle and the interior warms up slightly from body heat, the air expands its capacity to hold water. Then, as the night progresses and temperatures outside drop, the glass cools below what engineers call the dew point, the temperature at which air can no longer hold its moisture load. That moisture releases as liquid onto the first cold surface it finds. In a car with good seals and poor ventilation, that surface is everywhere. The windows, yes, but also the metal door panels, the underside of the roof lining, the rubber seals around the doors, which trap moisture and hold it. What makes vehicle condensation specifically dangerous, in a way that condensation in a room or tent is not, is the tightness of modern car seals, combined with the small enclosed volume. A 2022 Toyota UK analysis noted that newer vehicles seal better than older ones, which sounds like an advantage until the analysis continues. Better seals mean moist air cannot escape. The same engineering that keeps rain out keeps exhaled vapor in. A person sleeping in a 15-year-old car with slightly degraded door seals may actually experience less condensation accumulation than someone sleeping in a newer, tighter vehicle, because the older car leaks vapor out passively through imperfections. The newer car traps it efficiently. The obvious solutions fail one by one. Cracking windows works in theory, but invites rain, insects, security concerns, and cold air that can be more damaging than the condensation itself. Running the engine to power the defroster uses fuel, raises carbon monoxide risk if there is any obstruction near the exhaust, and marks the vehicle as occupied during hours when that visibility can become dangerous in certain neighborhoods. This is the cycle that breaks people down. They fight the symptom, and in doing so, they feed the cause. What is actually needed is a system that addresses moisture at its source, manages airflow with precision, and creates a physical barrier between the warm, damp air a sleeping person generates and the cold glass and metal surfaces that will convert it to liquid. That system exists. It has been refined by people who have slept in vehicles for months or years across climates, ranging from the Pacific Northwest to Phoenix in summer. It is not expensive. Some of the most effective components cost nothing at all. But it requires understanding that condensation is not about cold. It is about the relationship between humidity and surface temperature. And once that relationship is understood, it can be managed deliberately every single night without running the engine and without opening the vehicle wide enough to compromise safety or warmth. The first method is not a product. It is a decision made before the person ever closes the car door for the night. Everything that is wet belongs outside the vehicle or inside a sealed bag. Not damp, wet. Not slightly moist. Anything that carries residual water from rain, sweat, a laundromat that didn't fully dry the load, shoes walked through puddles, a towel used 2 hours ago. When wet clothes dry inside a vehicle, the moisture transfers directly into the cabin air. Most people who sleep in vehicles know this rule in theory and violate it every night in practice, because the car is where everything is and wet gear has nowhere else to go. The answer to this is not to find somewhere else to put it. It is to understand that a sealed plastic bag changes the equation entirely. Wet clothing inside a sealed bag does not release moisture into the cabin. It releases moisture inside the bag, which is a different enclosed system entirely. A woman who had spent 11 months sleeping in her Honda CR-V in Oakland described the shift this way. "I used to think damp was fine, that only soaking wet stuff was a problem. The night I put everything remotely wet into a garbage bag and tied it shut was the first morning the windows were just foggy instead of streaming. The bag goes in the trunk, or as far from the sleeping area as the vehicle allows. It does not go on the back seat where body heat from sleeping will warm it and accelerate evaporation into the same air being breathed all night." The second problem is the floor. Wet shoes, spills, and tracked-in rain introduce excess moisture that lingers overnight. Most vehicle dwellers put their shoes somewhere in the cabin because there is no obvious alternative. But shoes carry more moisture than almost anything else. Wet soles, wet laces, internal moisture from a full day of wearing. Shoes on the floor of a sealed vehicle overnight are moisture sources that operate continuously for 8 hours, releasing water vapor from the moment the door closes. The solution is the same sealed bag protocol, or, for those with SUVs and vans, positioning footwear in the cargo area as far from the sleeping compartment as possible, ideally elevated off the metal floor on a piece of cardboard or foam that breaks the conduction path between the cold metal and the wet shoe. A man who had been living in his F-150 in Houston for 4 months made the observation that his condensation problem almost entirely disappeared when he stopped storing his boots in the cab. "I was treating the truck like a room," he said. "In a room, wet boots dry by morning. In a sealed truck, they don't dry. They just keep sweating into the same air you're breathing." Hot air rises toward the ceiling, and because hot air holds far more water vapor than cold air, the moisture-laden air accumulates at the top of the cabin. This is why the windshield and rear window, the largest glass surfaces with the most exposure to cold air outside, show condensation first and worst. The ceiling liner in a van or SUV can accumulate moisture that never fully dries and begins developing mold in the fabric before any visible sign appears on the surface. The ventilation method that addresses this most effectively is counterintuitive to the point of feeling wrong. The opening should be positioned high, not low. A crack at the top of a rear window, or a sunroof cracked a centimeter, allows the warm, humid air rising from the sleeping person to exit the vehicle directly rather than circulating until it hits the glass. Running a roof vent fan in exhaust mode, pulling ceiling air outward, removes more water vapor per minute than any other passive method because it is targeting the air with the highest moisture load. For someone without a fan, the crack principle still applies. One high opening on the leeward side of the vehicle relative to wind direction allows humid air to exit without creating a cold draft directly across the sleeping area. The third layer is what sits between the sleeping person and the cold metal of the vehicle itself. An impervious vapor barrier on the warm side of any insulation prevents interstitial condensation from forming inside the insulation material. For someone with no budget for professional van insulation, the functional equivalent is reflective foam board. The silver-faced material available in hardware stores for a few dollars per sheet. Placed between the sleeping surface and any metal that makes direct contact with the cabin air. The physics is identical. The metal is cold, the air is warm, and anything placed between them that is impermeable to moisture prevents that moisture from condensing on the cold surface. It does not need to be elaborate. A sheet of reflective foam cut to fit the floor under the sleeping pad, and pieces cut to cover the lower third of the door panels where metal is exposed reduces condensation formation area by the majority of the vehicle's most problematic surfaces. A person who had lived in a Sprinter van for 7 months in Seattle explained the principle plainly. I wasted 3 months fighting the windows. The real problem was the floor and the doors. Once I covered the metal, the windows almost took care of themselves. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air, and critically, warm air that is vented can carry that moisture away with it. This is the principle that makes a brief burst of heat before sleep functional as a condensation control strategy rather than just a comfort measure. Running the vehicle heater for 10 to 15 minutes before shutting down for the night warms the cabin air, which raises the dew point, meaning the air must cool further before it releases moisture as liquid. Combined with a high crack that lets the humid, warmed air exit as it rises, this pre-sleep heat cycle pushes the worst of the moisture out of the vehicle before the person adds 8 more hours of breath to the system. The timing matters. The heat runs. The crack allows warm vapor to escape. Then the crack is adjusted for overnight position before sleep. The warm session is not for warmth. It is for moisture expulsion. Silica gel moisture absorber bags placed on the dashboard or in the footwell provide passive absorption throughout the night and can be recharged by microwaving them when they are saturated. The critical nuance, which most guides leave out, is that desiccant bags function as a secondary support system, not a primary one. A single kilogram of silica gel absorbs roughly 400 milliliters of water at best, and a single sleeping person produces far more than that through respiration alone across a full night. The bag does not solve the condensation problem. It manages the margin, the last small percentage of humidity that ventilation and moisture source control could not eliminate. Used correctly in a vehicle where the other methods are already running, a desiccant bag meaningfully reduces the morning dampness that would otherwise remain. Used alone without the sealed wet gear and the high ventilation crack and the vapor barrier layer, it is overwhelmed before 2 a.m. These methods are not independent. Each one reduces the moisture load that the next one has to handle. Sealing wet gear reduces the quantity of vapor entering the air. The high ventilation crack removes vapor before it hits the glass. The vapor barrier eliminates the surface area where condensation would form even if some vapor remains. The pre-sleep heat cycle pushes residual humidity out during the brief window when the vehicle can expel it efficiently. The desiccant bag catches what survives everything else. Remove any step from the chain, and the step after it fails under the load it was never designed to carry alone. The carbon monoxide risk has been present since Phase 1 without being named directly, and it needs to be named now. Running the vehicle heater for the pre-sleep moisture expulsion cycle is one of the most effective condensation management tools available to someone sleeping in a car, and it becomes lethal the moment snow accumulates around the exhaust pipe, or the vehicle is parked against a wall or berm that reflects exhaust back toward the undercarriage. The warning is not about running the engine in general. It is specific. Before starting the engine for any reason while sleeping in a vehicle, step outside and visually confirm the exhaust pipe is clear and unobstructed. This is not optional in winter conditions. Carbon monoxide is odorless, and the first symptom of poisoning in a sleeping person is deeper sleep, not distress. The tent heater alternative mentioned in some van life guides, propane or other combustion heaters, carries the same risk through a different mechanism. Any open flame heat source in an enclosed vehicle consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide. Ventilation that is sufficient for condensation management is not necessarily sufficient for combustion safety. If a portable heater is used, the ventilation opening must be larger than condensation management alone would require. And a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector positioned near the sleeping surface is not a luxury. It is the difference between waking up and not waking up. What the 5 methods amount to, spoken in the sequence a person actually executes them each night, is this. Before closing the door, everything wet goes into a sealed bag. Clothes, towels, shoes, anything that carried moisture through the day, and that bag goes as far from the sleeping area as the vehicle allows. The moment the door closes, no new moisture source is feeding the cabin air. Then, with one window cracked at its highest point on the side away from the wind, the vehicle heater runs for 10 to 15 minutes. Not for warmth, but to raise the cabin temperature enough that the warm, humid air rises, hits the high crack, and exits the vehicle carrying its moisture load with it. The crack stays open overnight, positioned high, pulling ceiling air outward. Under the sleeping surface, reflective foam board cuts off the largest cold metal surfaces from direct contact with cabin air, eliminating the primary condensation formation zones. And on the dashboard, a silica gel desiccant bag works through the night on whatever the ventilation and barrier layer could not fully capture. In the morning, the windows are foggy, not streaming, foggy. The bedding is not damp. The floor is not accumulating invisible moisture that will become mold in 3 weeks. The system worked because every stage handed a smaller problem to the stage that followed it. The people who figured this out did not read a guide. They slept in cars through Seattle winters and Phoenix summers and Chicago rain, and they paid attention to what the vehicle was doing, and they adjusted, and they shared what worked with whoever was sleeping nearby. The knowledge in these 5 methods was not engineered in a laboratory. It was discovered by people under genuine pressure. People for whom a respiratory problem developing over 3 weeks of bad condensation management was not a minor inconvenience, but a threat to the only shelter they had. The woman in Oakland who noticed the difference, a sealed bag made, did not have the option of moving to somewhere drier. The man in Denver who traced his cough back to moisture in his sleeping bag did not have the option of replacing the sleeping bag. They solved the problem with what they had, because the alternative was to get sicker in a vehicle that was slowly becoming uninhabitable from the inside out. That is what this knowledge is. It is not van life optimization. It is survival intelligence built by people who needed it to work, refined night after night until it did.